August 9th, 1942, 1:43 in the morning. Off Savo Island, Solomon Islands, USS Patterson broadcast a radio alarm that shattered the tropical night. "Warning! Warning! Strange ships entering harbor!" Within seconds, parachute flares dropped by Japanese float planes silhouetted American and Australian warships against the darkness. Searchlights snapped on. Shells began striking USS Chicago and HMAS Canberra. Then came the torpedoes, invisible, wakeless, impossibly fast. Within 5 minutes, Chicago's bow was gone, blown off by a weapon American intelligence insisted didn't exist. Canberra was sinking, torn apart by 2 torpedo hits and 24 shell strikes. The carnage had only begun. What the Americans didn't know, what their intelligence officers had refused to believe despite pre-war reports, was that Japanese destroyers and cruisers were launching weapons from 12,000 yards away, twice the range American captains had been trained to expect. The Japanese Type 93 torpedo, later nicknamed the Long Lance, was about to teach the United States Navy a brutal lesson. Sometimes your enemy isn't just better prepared. Sometimes they're years ahead. This is the story of how American arrogance collided with Japanese innovation, how a single weapon nearly changed the course of the Pacific War, and how it took capturing one of these torpedoes intact for U.S. engineers to admit that Japan had created the finest naval torpedo in history. The path to Savo Island began 15 years earlier, in 1927, when a Japanese naval inspector in Britain filed a report that would transform Japanese naval doctrine. He claimed he'd seen HMS Rodney equipped with oxygen-driven torpedoes. The report was wrong. Britain had abandoned oxygen torpedo development after fatal explosions during testing, but Japanese naval planners didn't know that. They saw an opportunity. Japan's problem was strategic and mathematical. The Washington Naval Treaty of 1922 had locked Japan into a 5-5-3 ratio of capital ships compared to the United States and Britain. In any future Pacific War, Japan would face the American battle line advancing westward under Plan Orange, the U.S. strategy for relieving the Philippines. Japanese war planners knew their inferior battle line would be destroyed in a decisive fleet engagement unless they could whittle down American strength before the final confrontation. Torpedoes were the answer. A torpedo fired from a destroyer or cruiser could cripple or destroy a battleship worth 50 times as much. But existing torpedoes had fatal limitations. American and British weapons used compressed air to power their engines. Compressed air is 21% oxygen and 78% nitrogen. The nitrogen contributes nothing to combustion and creates a massive bubble trail that advertises the torpedo's presence. Range and speed were limited by the oxidizer available. In 1928, Rear Admiral Kaneji Kishimoto and Captain Toshihide Asakuma began development of what would become the Type 93. Their goal was revolutionary: create a torpedo powered by pure oxygen. Pure oxygen provides 5 times as much oxidizer in the same tank volume, dramatically increasing both range and speed. And because pure oxygen combustion produces only carbon dioxide and water vapor, both highly soluble in water, the bubble trail would be nearly invisible. The engineering challenges were staggering. Pure oxygen is violently reactive. Mix it with oil or introduce it too quickly into a combustion chamber, and you get an explosion, not propulsion. Early tests were disasters. Torpedoes detonated on launch. Sharp turns in oxygen tubing compressed and heated the gas until it explosively reacted with microscopic oil traces. Development teams suffered casualties. Captain Kishimoto and his engineers solved the problems through meticulous attention to detail. They eliminated all sharp turns in oxygen tubing. They cleaned tubes with strong alkali solutions that removed every trace of oil. They designed the engine to start on compressed air from a separate bottle, only gradually switching to pure oxygen once combustion was stable. They manufactured components with precision that pushed Japanese industrial capabilities to their limits. By 1933, the Type 93 was ready for testing. The specifications were extraordinary. The torpedo measured 29.5 feet long with a 24-inch diameter. It weighed over 6,000 pounds, more than 3 tons. The warhead carried 1,080 pounds of HMAS explosive, roughly equivalent to the punch of a 16-inch naval gun. But the true revolution was performance. At high speed setting, the Type 93 could reach 49 knots and travel 22,000 yards, over 11 nautical miles. At the slower setting of 36 knots, range extended to an incredible 44,000 yards, 22 miles. Compare that to the American Mark 15 torpedo, maximum range of 15,000 yards at 26.5 knots, or 6,000 yards at 45 knots. The American weapon carried only 827 pounds of explosive. The Type 93 wasn't just better. It operated in a completely different performance envelope. Japanese naval officers who witnessed early tests understood immediately what they possessed. The Imperial Japanese Navy designated the Type 93 its most important secret weapon. Torpedo officers were forbidden to discuss it with officers not directly involved with torpedo operations. Speed and range settings were omitted from training manuals. Even the fact that the torpedo used oxygen was classified. Training exercises were conducted under such strict secrecy that ships had to recover every torpedo fired, sometimes spending hours searching for a single weapon even in rough weather. The secrecy extended to the torpedoes themselves. Aboard ship, the oxygen storage system was labeled secondary air tank. Most crew members had no idea what actually powered their torpedoes. This created its own problems. As American air superiority grew during the war, Japanese captains facing air attack had to decide whether to jettison their Type 93 torpedoes as a precaution. A single bomb hit near the oxygen tanks could destroy the ship. But the weapons were so valuable that commanders often took the risk. By 1935, the Type 93 was operational. By 1938, it equipped Japan's heavy cruisers. By 1940, improved models were being installed on destroyers. Japanese cruisers and destroyers mounted their torpedo tubes in formations ranging from twin to quintuple launchers. Some destroyers carried reload torpedoes with fast reload mechanisms, essentially doubling their available firepower. The Type 92 quadruple mount, typical of modern destroyer classes, could launch its torpedoes at 40 feet per second using compressed air, silently, giving no warning to enemy ships that they were under attack. Japanese destroyer and cruiser crews trained relentlessly in night torpedo tactics. They practiced long-range launches, rapid reloads, and coordinated mass attacks. By December 7, 1941, when Pearl Harbor brought America into the war, the Imperial Japanese Navy possessed the finest torpedo force in the world, equipped with a weapon American intelligence didn't believe existed. The Americans had received warnings. A U.S. naval attaché filed a pre-war report claiming he'd visited a Japanese destroyer equipped with 24-inch torpedoes, 6 inches larger than standard. The Bureau of Ordnance rejected the report. Japanese torpedoes couldn't possibly be larger or better than American weapons. The rejection was rooted in arrogance tinged with racism. Made in Japan meant cheap and inferior. American engineers had convinced themselves that Japanese industry couldn't produce precision weapons. They were catastrophically wrong. The first American encounter with the Long Lance came at the Battle of the Java Sea on February 27, 1942. Dutch Rear Admiral Karel Doorman led a combined American, British, Dutch, and Australian force against Japanese invasion convoys. The Japanese heavy cruisers Haguro and Nachi, operating far beyond what Allied commanders believed was torpedo range, launched spreads of Type 93 torpedoes from 22,000 yards away. The Dutch light cruiser De Ruyter exploded and sank, taking Admiral Doorman with her. The destroyer Kortenaer was hit at approximately 22,000 yards, one of the longest-range torpedo strikes in naval history. The Dutch cruiser Java went down. American heavy cruiser Houston and Australian cruiser Perth survived the battle only to be sunk the following night at the Battle of Sunda Strait by Type 93 torpedoes from the heavy cruisers Mogami and Mikuma. Allied commanders were baffled. Ships were being struck by torpedoes when no Japanese vessels were visible. The hits were attributed to submarines operating in coordination with surface forces or to mines. The possibility that Japanese destroyers and cruisers could launch torpedoes from ranges exceeding 10 miles never occurred to Allied naval officers. The shock came at Savo Island. Vice Admiral Gunichi Mikawa commanded a force of 7 cruisers and 1 destroyer racing down the Slot, the passage between the Solomon Islands, toward the American landing force at Guadalcanal. American radar-equipped destroyers detected the Japanese force but misidentified it. By the time USS Patterson broadcast her warning, Mikawa's ships were already launching torpedoes and opening fire at point-blank range. The Southern screening force was hit first. Chicago took a torpedo hit that blew off her bow. Canberra absorbed 2 torpedo strikes and 24 shell hits. She was sinking within 5 minutes. Then Mikawa's formation rounded Savo Island and engaged the northern force, USS Vincennes, USS Astoria, and USS Quincy. The American cruisers were caught completely unprepared. Most crews were at reduced alert status. Officers on Astoria's bridge initially refused to believe they were under attack, ordering their guns to cease fire because they thought they were shooting at friendly ships. The Japanese illuminated their targets with searchlights and opened fire. Vincennes was struck by at least 2 torpedoes and 74 shell hits. She capsized and sank within an hour. Quincy took at least 36 shell hits and 2 torpedo strikes. 1 torpedo exploded in her fire rooms, another near her interior communications room. She rolled over and sank bow first. Astoria absorbed at least 65 shell hits. Although her structural damage wasn't immediately fatal, fires raged out of control. She burned through the night and sank the following noon. In less than 1 hour, the Imperial Japanese Navy had eliminated 4 Allied heavy cruisers while suffering only minor damage to their own forces. The water around Savo Island became known as Iron Bottom Sound because of the number of ships resting on the seabed. The defeat was the worst blue water naval battle in United States Navy history. Survivors described something they couldn't explain: torpedoes striking from impossible distances with no warning. American captains had been trained to zigzag their ships when within torpedo range, but they calculated torpedo range based on American weapons. Japanese destroyers and cruisers were launching from twice that distance, striking ships whose commanders believed they were safely out of range. Lieutenant Valmore Baudreau, a P-47 Thunderbolt pilot who witnessed a later engagement, described seeing a Japanese destroyer launch torpedoes. There was no visible wake, no bubble trail, nothing to warn the ships they were under attack until the weapons struck. It was like being shot by an invisible gun. The mystery deepened through the Solomon Islands campaign. USS Northampton was sunk at the Battle of Tassafaronga. USS Helena went down at Kula Gulf. Destroyers USS Strong, Chevalier, Gwynn, and Cooper were destroyed. In each case, Type 93 torpedoes struck from ranges American commanders hadn't thought possible. Naval intelligence continued attributing strikes to submarines despite mounting evidence otherwise. The breakthrough came in 1943. During operations on Guadalcanal, a Type 93 torpedo beached itself at Point Cruz. Marines discovered it partially buried in sand on the reef. The massive weapon was unlike anything they'd seen. It dwarfed American torpedoes. The torpedo was recovered carefully and shipped to the United States. American naval ordnance experts finally had a chance to examine Japan's secret weapon. What they discovered shocked them. The torpedo's size was immediately apparent. Nearly 30 feet long, 24 inches in diameter, 3 tons of precision-engineered weapon. American engineers examined the propulsion system, noting the sophisticated oxygen feed mechanism and the carefully machined tubing designed to prevent explosions. They tested the gyroscope, a precision instrument transported in specially designed wooden boxes to prevent damage. They analyzed the warhead, over 1,000 pounds of high explosive, enough to break a destroyer in half with a single hit. But they still didn't understand the oxidizer system. Initial analysis identified large compressed gas tanks, but didn't recognize that they contained pure oxygen rather than air. Bureau of Ordnance estimates of the torpedo's performance remained far below reality. It wasn't until February 1944 that American intelligence finally understood what they were facing. Analysis of captured documents and prisoner interrogations revealed the truth. The Type 93 used pure oxygen. American engineers recalculated performance based on this information. The numbers were staggering. A February 1944 survey credited the Type 93 with a range of 22,400 yards at 50 knots and 33,000 yards at 32 knots. A March 1944 report incorporating more prisoner interrogations refined the figures: 32,700 to 33,800 yards at 32 knots and 11,000 yards at 47 knots. The July 1944 edition of Statistical Summary of the Japanese Navy described the Type 93 as probably the most radical and spectacular development in naval ordnance that has appeared in the Pacific theater. The report credited it with a 1,200-pound warhead and acknowledged its devastating effectiveness. American engineers studying the captured torpedo at the Washington Navy Yard wrote assessments that read like confessions. One engineer's report stated, "The Type 93 represents engineering achievement substantially beyond our own torpedo development. The oxygen propulsion system, while dangerous to handle, provides performance we cannot currently match." The Japanese have solved metallurgical and combustion problems we did not know existed. Another report focused on tactical implications. American naval doctrine assumed torpedo range parity with potential enemies. This assumption was catastrophically incorrect. Japanese destroyers and cruisers have been engaging our forces from ranges we believed safe. This explains the heavy losses at Savo Island, Tassafaronga, and subsequent engagements. Our casualty figures make sense only when we accept that Japanese torpedoes have twice the effective range of our own weapons. The Bureau of Ordnance faced uncomfortable questions about why they had rejected pre-war intelligence reports. An internal investigation revealed that racism and technological arrogance had blinded American analysts to Japanese capabilities. The phrase, "made in Japan," had been synonymous with cheap imitation goods throughout the 1930s. American engineers had assumed Japanese industry couldn't produce precision weapons. That assumption had cost over 1,000 American lives at Savo Island alone. The Type 93's sophistication extended beyond its propulsion system. The gyroscope that kept it on course spun at thousands of revolutions per minute, powered by the torpedo's own steam generation. It had to maintain stability and direction during runs exceeding 20,000 yards, over 11 miles. The precision required was extraordinary. Post-war analysis showed the gyroscope's construction quality matched or exceeded anything produced in the United States. The warhead detonator was remarkably reliable. While American Mark 14 torpedoes suffered from catastrophic detonator failures throughout 1942 and 1943, submarine commanders reported firing perfect shots at Japanese carriers only to have torpedoes fail to explode. The Type 93's detonator worked consistently. Japanese engineers had tested their torpedoes extensively against actual ship hulks before the war, something American ordnance bureaus had neglected to do. The result was a weapon that performed reliably in combat conditions. American submariners could only watch with envy as reports of Type 93 effectiveness filtered through the fleet. Lieutenant Commander Dudley "Mush" Morton, one of America's most aggressive submarine commanders, came back empty-handed from a patrol in May 1943 due to faulty American torpedoes. On April 9, 1943, Lieutenant Commander John Scott on USS Tunney had 3 perfect shots at Japanese carriers Junyo, Hiyo, and Taiyo. He fired all 10 torpedo tubes. Not one struck. The Mark 14's problems, running too deep, faulty magnetic detonators, weak contact detonators, weren't fully resolved until mid-1944. Meanwhile, the Type 93 worked. Japanese torpedo crews launched spreads from extreme range with confidence that their weapons would run straight, strike hard, and detonate reliably. The psychological impact on American sailors was severe. Destroyers and cruisers approaching Japanese forces knew they might be under attack from distances where visual detection was impossible. The nearly wakeless torpedoes gave no warning. The first indication of danger was often the massive explosion as over 1,000 pounds of high explosive detonated against the hull. The Type 93 had vulnerabilities. Its HMAS explosive warhead was more shock-sensitive than TNT-filled torpedoes, meaning it could be detonated by nearby explosions. Several Japanese ships were destroyed when bomb strikes near their torpedo storage triggered secondary explosions. The heavy cruiser Mikuma at Midway suffered catastrophic damage when American dive bombers hit her torpedo storage. The cruiser Chikuma survived the Battle of Santa Cruz Islands because she jettisoned her torpedoes before being struck by bombs. The weapon's size also created tactical limitations. Type 93. Torpedoes were too large for submarine torpedo tubes. Japan developed a smaller version, the Type 95, for submarine use, but it couldn't match the surface-launched weapon's performance. The massive torpedoes required specialized handling equipment and trained crews. Reload times, though faster than American or British systems, still limited sustained combat effectiveness. Most critically, the Type 93's effectiveness depended on night combat conditions. Japanese tactics emphasized closing to torpedo range under cover of darkness, launching massive spreads, and escaping before dawn. These tactics worked brilliantly in the Solomon Islands campaign, where restricted waters and mountainous terrain provided cover. They worked less well in open ocean engagements, where American radar could detect Japanese forces at long range. As American radar technology improved through 1943 and 1944, Japanese advantages in night combat eroded. American ships could detect Japanese forces, establish firing solutions, and engage with accurate radar-directed gunfire before Japanese torpedo attacks could develop. The Battle of Cape St. George in November 1943 demonstrated this shift. American destroyers, using radar fire control, eliminated 3 Japanese destroyers before the Japanese could effectively employ their torpedoes. But even as tactical conditions shifted against Japan, the Type 93 remained the finest torpedo in the world. Post-war analysis confirmed its supremacy. No Allied torpedo matched its combination of range, speed, and warhead size. The American Mark 15, the British 21-inch, the Soviet 53-38, all were inferior in every measurable category. American torpedo development accelerated dramatically once engineers understood what Japan had achieved. The Mark 16, introduced in 1943, incorporated lessons learned from captured Type 93 analysis. American submarines received priority for improved Mark 14 torpedoes with corrected depth-keeping mechanisms and redesigned detonators. By mid-1944, American torpedo performance had improved substantially, though still not matching Japanese capabilities. The human cost of American technological arrogance was calculated in the thousands. 23 Allied warships were sunk after Type 93 strikes, 11 cruisers, 11 destroyers, and 1 fleet aircraft carrier. 13 of these were destroyed solely by torpedo damage. The rest succumbed to combined torpedo and gunfire. Each sinking represented hundreds of sailors lost, young men from farms in Iowa, cities in California, towns across Australia and Britain. They died because their commanders believed they were safe from torpedo attack, when in fact they were well within range of weapons their intelligence officers had insisted didn't exist. USS Quincy lost 389 men, USS Vincennes lost 342, USS Astoria lost 235, HMAS Canberra lost 85, USS Northampton lost 58. The list continued through 1943, each name representing a ship torn apart by a weapon American engineers had been too arrogant to believe existed. The captured Type 93 on display at the Washington Navy Yard during World War II became a teaching tool. Officers and engineers studied it, learning lessons that would influence American naval weapons development for decades. The torpedo remained on display after the war, a reminder of what happens when technological arrogance meets battlefield reality. In 1985, at a reunion of American and Japanese naval veterans in Arizona, a former American destroyer captain approached a Japanese torpedo officer who had served in the Solomon Islands. Through an interpreter, the American asked a question that had haunted him for 40 years. "How did you know where we were? Your torpedoes struck from distances we thought were impossible." The Japanese veteran smiled sadly. "We trained for night combat for 10 years before the war. We had excellent night optics, 7-power binoculars that magnified starlight, and we had the Type 93. You called it the Long Lance. We called it our equalizer. It gave us the range to strike from darkness, the speed to reach you before you could evade, and the power to destroy even the toughest cruiser with 2 or 3 hits." The American nodded slowly. "We were told Japanese torpedoes were inferior to ours. Our intelligence was wrong." "Your intelligence was arrogant," the Japanese veteran corrected gently. "You believed made in Japan meant inferior. We spent 15 years proving that assumption wrong. By the time you learned the truth, over 1,000 of your sailors were dead." The conversation ended in silence. Both men understood the fundamental lesson of the Type 93. In war, underestimating your enemy's capabilities isn't just foolish, it's fatal. The Long Lance's legacy extended far beyond World War II. Soviet engineers, who captured Japanese torpedoes in the closing days of the war, reverse-engineered the oxygen propulsion system for their own weapons. Modern Russian torpedoes trace their lineage directly to the Type 93. The United States, despite studying the captured torpedoes extensively, never adopted oxygen propulsion for its own weapons. American engineers concluded the system was too dangerous for operational use, requiring training and handling procedures that American doctrine couldn't accommodate. Instead, American torpedo development focused on guidance systems, acoustic homing, and eventually wire-guided and wake-homing technologies. Modern American torpedoes are slower and carry smaller warheads than the Type 93, but compensate with sophisticated targeting systems that the Japanese weapon lacked. The museum at Annapolis displays a Type 93 torpedo outside Dahlgren Hall, flanked by a Type 91 aerial torpedo on the opposite side of the pathway. Students at the Naval Academy walk past it daily, most unaware of the weapon's history. A small placard provides specifications: 29.5 feet long, 24 inches in diameter, 3 tons, 1,080-pound warhead, maximum range 22,000 yards at 49 knots. The numbers tell the story, but they don't convey the shock American engineers felt when they finally understood what Japan had created. The Type 93 represents a cautionary tale about technological assumptions. American industry in 1942 was vastly superior to Japanese industry in almost every measurable category. American factories produced more steel, more ships, more aircraft, more of everything. But in one specific technology, oxygen-powered torpedoes, Japan was years ahead. That narrow superiority, combined with Japanese tactical excellence in night combat, nearly changed the outcome of the Guadalcanal campaign. If Admiral Mikawa had followed up his victory at Savo Island by destroying the American transport ships unloading at Guadalcanal, the entire operation might have collapsed. Marines ashore would have been isolated without supplies or reinforcements. The first American offensive in the Pacific could have ended in disaster. Mikawa withdrew, fearing American carrier aircraft that had actually already departed the area. His caution saved the American position, but the lesson remained. Technological surprise can be decisive. American sailors at Savo Island faced an enemy whose weapons exceeded their understanding of what was possible. They died not through lack of courage, but through institutional arrogance that refused to accept that Japan could produce superior weapons. The captured Type 93 torpedo forced American naval leadership to confront uncomfortable truths. Japanese engineers were not inferior. Japanese industry, while smaller than American industry, was capable of remarkable precision, and made in Japan could mean the finest weapon of its type in the world. Those lessons, purchased with over 1,000 American lives at Savo Island and thousands more in subsequent engagements, transformed American intelligence doctrine. Never again would Bureau of Ordnance reject reports of enemy weapons capabilities because they seemed too advanced. Never again would American commanders assume their weapons were superior simply because they were American. The Type 93, Long Lance, remains the finest torpedo of World War II. It combined revolutionary propulsion technology, exceptional range and speed, devastating explosive power, and remarkable reliability into a weapon that dominated Pacific naval combat for 2 years. American engineers who examined captured examples admitted what their pre-war colleagues had refused to believe. Japan had created something extraordinary. That admission, grudging and painful, marked the moment American technological arrogance confronted reality. In the wreckage of 4 cruisers at the bottom of Iron Bottom Sound, in the careful analysis of the torpedo recovered at Point Cruz, In the revised intelligence estimates that finally acknowledged Japanese superiority, American naval power learned humility. The long lance taught the lesson with brutal efficiency. Sometimes your enemy isn't just prepared, sometimes they're better. And sometimes the only way to learn that truth is through defeat.